We all know spring can be a tricky time to plant. Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we'll discuss a few ways to protect your plants from an early spring freeze. Let's get going. Well, as we've shown here at the Garden Hutch, late winter and early spring can be unpredictable from a weather standpoint. So one of the things that we always like to do when we plant is each bed we like to have a different plan depending on the stage of the plant. So we like to do it from, if it's a seed, we do this, if it's a sprout, we do this, so on and so forth. So we're going to review a few of those things today. Before we get started, one thing I did want to touch on is if your weatherman says that the temperature is going to get down to 35 degrees, at that point, I highly recommend you assume you're going to get at least a frost. The reason for that is weathermen, they have a tough job. All of those sciences are unpredictable at best, and I'm sure they do the best they can. So I'm not trying to bag on those folks, but especially here in zone 7B, they are wrong a lot. And anyway, earlier this season, we kind of got bit on that a little bit. The temperature was about 4 degrees lower than what was predicted. We lost some tomato plants. Good thing it was early, it didn't hurt anything, no setbacks. But since then, we've sort of made the rule, if it's 35 or below, we treat it as though it's going to frost. So keep that in mind as we go forward. One of the reasons that we enjoy growing in raised beds so much is that they warm up faster than in-ground beds. And what that means is whenever springtime or late winter, early spring, depending on where you live, when that time comes, the soil is workable a lot sooner. So a lot of the seeds, beets, carrots, turnips, radishes, those sorts of things, the instructions on the packet will tell you to plant the seeds as soon as the ground is workable. Those seeds are naturally going to be cold resistant, okay? So when you plant those and you have a hard freeze coming in, you don't necessarily have to worry about it too much. So here in Arkansas, usually our cold will be like 19. I think this year 19 was the cold. So if you put carrot seeds in the ground, 19 is not going to hurt that carrot seed. When the time comes, the seed's going to do its business and it's going to come up. So as a general rule, as long as you're planting by direction, if the seeds are in the ground, that's not something to worry about. In fact, that's one of the advantage we have as being raised bed gardeners, is we get to start our plants just a little bit earlier than the folks around us because the soil warms up and you can work that soil a little bit earlier. So like we said, we'll break it down. When it comes to seeds, if they're in the ground and they haven't come up yet, you're good to go as long as you followed the directions. Let's just say, for example, though, that you started a little earlier than you should, you got a little overexcited, and let's say you put something like squash plants in the ground in mid-March and you've got a freeze coming up, the seeds are in the ground, they haven't come up yet, and you're concerned about them. No reason to worry. All you have to do, just take a handful of leaves, put it over the mound of squash that you did, cover that with like a sheet or a blanket, and you'll be good to go. So we understand that our seeds are probably going to be okay, and if we're a little concerned about them, we can do something as simple as just covering them up with a little bit of mulch, and we remove that. But let's say, like our radishes here, that we have a hard freeze coming, and they have just broken the surface. Now, radishes by and large are very resistant to cold. However, if we get a hard freeze, it could kill the sprouts at this point. Most freezes won't kill the actual radish plant, but when they're small like this, they're much more vulnerable. So what do? Well, we recommend using something like this. All we do is, if there's a hard freeze coming, you just take this and turn it upside down over the top of your seedlings. Use them, cover the whole row. It might take a dozen or so, and that will prevent those seedlings from catching the frost. If you want to do an added layer of protection, all you have to do is put a light blanket over the top of the planters, and it will prevent the frost from hurting your plants. Well, here in Zone 7B, we always like to get our plants in as soon as possible. And it seems like at least every other year we have a odd frost that'll move through in the middle of April, sometimes end of April, kind of like last year. And that ends up catching a lot of gardeners by surprise. We've had it happen to us enough here at the Garden Hutch. We do not plant tomatoes or peppers until the last weekend of April. So this year that'll be April 31st. But if you feel brave and you feel like you want to get your plants in the ground and the weatherman says it's going to come a frost, don't worry. It's super easy to protect your plants. Most of us, when we plant peppers or tomatoes, we're going to give them either some kind of tomato cage or a trellising system, or even something as simple as a stake for them to grow on so the wind doesn't knock them one way or the other. If they're predicting a frost, all you need to do is just take a sheet and pull it down the row and make sure it sits on top of your stake. So you don't want it touching your plant. So if you need to, you can put it on top of the stake, pull the edges taut a little bit, and then put rocks on the edges of it. The idea is to create a barrier between the sheet and the actual plant itself. So as long as there's air between those two and it's a light frost, your plants will be just fine. So what you can do is the different stages of cold, if it's going to go from either a frost down to a freeze, then just adjust the thickness of the material you put over the top. So 3 years ago, it got down to 29 degrees. And I think it was April 14th or something. It was really cold. And a lot of people had their plants in the ground. And what we recommended doing is we just took a thicker blanket, right? You just put your stakes out in that thicker blanket. You do the same thing you would with a sheet. You just stretch it wider and then you put your rocks out. And in fact, if you're, when in doubt, right, use a thicker. So we use sheets. We try to keep the sheets in the greenhouse whenever we can. But if we think it might even get a little colder than that, we'll just go ahead and pull the plug and use a blanket instead. It's really not worth it at this time of the year to take a risk on your tomato plants, especially if you start your own. If it's April 15th and your tomato plants get burned from a frost, you're going to either have to not have tomatoes or go buy them from somewhere. You're not going to have the time to bring them from seed up and still get the kind of harvest you're going to want from your garden. So again, just make sure that you err on the side of caution. 35 degrees or below, just assume you're going to go ahead and get at least a light frost, cover everything, and you'll be good to go. I almost forgot to mention bulbs, things like onions and garlic, or if you're in planting, you plant your bulbs for the spring. If you're going to do this, there is really no recommendation. All you really need to do is make sure that you do the research on what you're planting and get the appropriate bulb for your area. So for us, for example, we're here in 7B. We can grow, if we choose, we can grow the soft neck variety of garlic, and those go in the early spring. We choose to grow the stiff neck variety, and they go in the ground in October. So what we did was we made sure that these were compatible with our environment. So we got the Romanian red garlic, and when you do the research on those, they say in our environment they'll just grow all the way through the fall, winter, and into the spring, and that's exactly what happened. This exact same variety, though, you can plant in much colder climates, and it just doesn't come up until early spring. So just as a caveat here on your bulbs, all you really need to do with these is make sure that you get the correct ones for your area. Well, as always, I would like to say thank you to you folks that have made it this far. If you have not, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the little bell icon. YouTube will let you know when we upload new content. And until next time, I hope that you folks take care of yourselves. Peace.